The obsidian palace loomed over the valley like a shadow carved in stone. Its black towers pierced the clouds, and its walls seemed to drink the light of the sun. Within those walls, the Alpha King ruled with strength and fear, his word law, his gaze judgment. Nobles bowed and whispered, and servants moved like shadows, careful not to draw attention. Yet in the middle of this grand, suffocating court, one figure was always overlooked. Prince Kalen, the king's only son, sat alone in the corner of the great hall. His eyes were storm-gray, sharp and bright, but his lips never spoke a word. Since birth, Kalen had been mute. He did not cry like other children, did not laugh like other boys, and did not answer when called. The court treated him as if he were invisible, a ghost who moved among them but belonged nowhere. Whispers followed him everywhere he went. "Do you think the boy understands anything?" one noble whispered, glancing at Kalen from across the hall. "He is the Alpha King's blood," another replied, voice low. But his silence, "It frightens me." Kalen did not hear them, or perhaps he did. He often wondered which was worse, to be invisible or to be feared. Either way, he had learned to watch and wait, to observe every expression, every gesture, every hidden motive. And behind the calmness in his eyes, a storm of thoughts and feelings raged. It was on a cold morning, when the mist curled around the palace like a living thing, that Seraphine arrived. She was a scholar and healer, known in distant lands for her knowledge of magic, languages, and ancient texts. Her hair was the color of midnight, and her eyes carried a quiet fire. She was not afraid of the obsidian palace or its terrible reputation. She had been summoned by the Alpha King himself, though she did not yet know why. From the moment she entered the great hall, Seraphine noticed Kalen. Most of the courtiers had already turned away, whispering and laughing quietly, but she could not. There was something in the boy's eyes, a depth, a loneliness, a hunger to be seen, that called to her. She stopped in front of him and smiled gently. Kalen's hands twitched. He had never felt anyone look at him like that before. His parents, his tutors, the guards, they all treated him as if he were fragile, or as if his silence made him less than human. But Seraphine's gaze held no pity. It held curiosity. It held understanding. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her hands and began to sign. "Hello. My name is Seraphine." Kalen froze. He had seen many gestures before, many words spoken through the air by hand, but none that felt like magic, none that felt like someone speaking directly to the part of him that had been left unheard. He responded with a small, careful sign. "Kalen." Seraphine nodded, her smile soft and encouraging. She continued, "Would you like to walk with me?" Kalen hesitated. The last time someone had tried to engage with him, long ago, they had grown impatient and left. But there was something about Seraphine that felt different. Carefully, he signed back, "Yes." They walked together through the palace corridors, the morning sun falling in long streaks across the marble floors. Courtiers turned to stare, whispers following them like shadows. Some looked amused, others skeptical. But Kalen did not care. With Seraphine, the court's judgment could not reach him. "You are very observant," she signed as they walked. "You see things others do not." Kalen's fingers moved quickly, excited for the first time in years. "I must see everything. If I do not, how will I know the truth?" Seraphine's lips curved into a smile. She understood. He did not speak because words were often dangerous in the court. Silence had been his shield. But she could see the intelligence in him, sharp and bright like the sun reflecting off the palace walls. As they wandered, Seraphine asked questions about the palace, the people, the history. Kalen answered through his hands carefully, sometimes with a small drawing on parchment when the concept was too complex. She watched him work, fascinated by the rhythm and grace of his movements. "You are clever," she signed. "Do you know how powerful you are?" Kalen looked down, uncertain. He had never thought of himself as powerful. Most of the court saw weakness and silence, but in Seraphine's eyes he saw belief. And for the first time, Kalen wondered if he could be more than what everyone assumed. The morning passed quickly. By the time the sun reached its peak, Kalen and Seraphine found themselves in the palace gardens. The garden was overgrown, wild with vines and shadows, a place the courtiers rarely visited. Birds sang quietly in the trees, and the air smelled of damp earth and flowers. Here, away from the court's judgment, Kalen felt free. He signed quickly, his hands trembling with emotion. Why do they all ignore me? Seraphine's eyes softened. She took his hands in hers and signed slowly. Because they do not see you, Kaelin. But I see you, and I will not stop seeing you. Kaelin's chest tightened. No one had ever said anything like that to him. His mother, the queen, had been distant, his tutors harsh, his father proud and commanding. And yet, here was someone who looked at him as a person, not a shadow. For the first time, Kaelin laughed silently, a small, breathless sound that did not escape his lips, but lit his eyes. Seraphine laughed too, a soft musical sound that seemed to echo through the garden. Together they felt a connection that neither fully understood, a bridge between silence and speech, between isolation and belonging. Suddenly, a shadow passed over the garden. Kaelin's eyes narrowed. Even in this hidden place, danger never truly rested. The Alpha King's men were never far, and the palace itself held secrets that whispered in the dark. Kaelin signed quickly. The crown carries a shadow. Seraphine's brow furrowed. A shadow? What do you mean? Kaelin pointed toward the palace, then back at himself, and signed with urgency. Danger waits for those who are ignored, and for those who speak. Seraphine felt a shiver run down her spine. There was truth in his warning, a darkness that lay beneath the glittering walls waiting for the unwary, and yet she also felt a surge of determination. If Kaelin could survive in a court that overlooked and underestimated him, she would not turn away. The garden fell silent as the wind whispered through the trees. Kaelin looked at Seraphine with an intensity she had never seen before. Though his lips did not move, his eyes spoke volumes: fear, longing, courage, and a spark of hope. Seraphine reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Her fingers lingered, gentle and warm, and Kaelin felt a tremor of something he had never known: trust. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the palace, Seraphine knew their meeting was no accident. Kaelin was not merely a mute prince. He was a puzzle, a storm, a key to something far greater than the whispers of the court could ever imagine. And Kaelin, for the first time, realized that perhaps silence was not weakness. It could be a power all its own. But the court was not idle. Whispers had begun to stir, and eyes that never missed a thing had noticed the scholar and the boy together. Curiosity could easily turn to suspicion, and in the Obsidian Palace, suspicion was dangerous. Kaelin signed one last message as they turned back toward the palace. Watch closely, Seraphine. Not all shadows are behind doors. Some move with the light. Seraphine's heart tightened. She understood the meaning. The palace, the king, the court, all were a labyrinth of secrets, danger, and unseen forces. And Kaelin, the boy who had been ignored, would not face it alone. As they walked back into the cold marble halls, their hands brushed once more. A silent promise passed between them, unspoken yet absolute. In the midst of a world filled with power, fear, and shadow, two souls had found recognition and trust, and somewhere, deep in the Obsidian Palace, a hidden threat stirred. Noticing the boy who had begun to speak in a language no one else understood, and the scholar who dared to see him, the game of shadows and silence had begun. The morning after their secret meeting in the gardens, Kaelin sat alone in his chambers, sunlight slipping through the tall windows in thin golden lines. He traced the patterns of the light with his fingers, feeling the warmth on his skin, but his mind was elsewhere. Seraphine had left him with questions and, more importantly, with a new sense of possibility. For the first time, he wondered if silence could become more than a prison. A soft knock at the door made him start. "May I come in?" Seraphine signed from the threshold, her expression calm but curious. Kaelin nodded, gesturing for her to enter. She stepped inside, her cloak brushing the floor, and placed a small satchel on the desk. "I brought something," she signed, opening the bag carefully. Scrolls, parchment, and quills spilled out. "We can try writing together. Perhaps it will help you share what you cannot say aloud." Kaelin's eyes lit up. Writing had been one of his few escapes, but the court had never allowed him the freedom to experiment. With Seraphine, he felt safe. He picked up a quill, dipping it in ink, and began to write quickly, the words flowing from his mind like a river. "They do not see me. They fear me. They do not understand what lives in silence." Seraphine read the words and nodded slowly. She signed back, "Silence is a shield, Kaelin, but it can also be a key." Kaelin's fingers trembled. "A key?" "Yes," she signed. It can open doors you did not know existed. He stared at her, trying to imagine how silence could be power. Until now, it had only been a barrier, but in her presence, every gesture, every sign, every movement became meaningful. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps his muteness was not weakness. It was an unseen strength, one that could change the way the court viewed him. Days passed, and Seraphine returned each morning. Together they explored the palace in silence, communicating in signs, in glances, in subtle movements that only they could understand. Kaelin began to notice details he had never before observed. The way the king's advisors shifted their eyes when no one else was looking, the subtle tensions in the courtiers' postures, the secret passages that led to forgotten corners of the palace. One afternoon, Seraphine guided him to the library, a massive hall lined with towering shelves of ancient books. Dust floated in the golden sunlight, and the air smelled of parchment and old ink. Kaelin had been here many times, but the library had never felt alive. With Seraphine, it seemed magical. "This place holds more than words," she signed, leading him to a shelf of scrolls bound in faded leather. "There are histories here that no one remembers. Stories of the past, of kings and princes, of curses and choices." Kaelin leaned closer to a scroll, his fingers tracing the faded symbols. Something stirred in him, a sense of connection, as if the words on the page were reaching out to him across time. He signed quickly, "I see them. The shadows in the stories, they are like the ones I feel in the palace." Seraphine nodded, her eyes serious. "Yes, the court, the crown. There are forces you cannot see, Kaelin. Forces tied to your blood, to your family. You must learn to recognize them before they move against you." Kaelin felt a shiver run down his spine. He had always known the palace held secrets, but Seraphine's words made those secrets tangible. The shadows were not just whispers in the halls, they were alive, waiting for a chance to strike. Over the next week, their bond grew. Kaelin discovered he could share his thoughts in ways he had never tried before. Sometimes he drew maps of the palace corridors, noting hidden rooms and passages. Sometimes he sketched symbols from ancient texts, trying to understand their meaning. Seraphine watched and guided him, her fingers moving gracefully in the air, her expression calm and encouraging. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the towers, casting long shadows across the stone floor, Kaelin signed something new. "I have visions. When I close my eyes, I see people and places, and warnings. Shadows that move without sound." Seraphine's gaze darkened. "Visions," she signed. "Tell me more." Kaelin hesitated. He had never told anyone about the images that came to him in dreams and moments of quiet. But with her, he felt a strange confidence. "I see the palace burning. I see betrayal. I see my own family. And I cannot speak to warn them." Seraphine reached out, brushing his hand lightly. "Then we will find another way. We will learn to fight the shadows together." For the first time, Kaelin imagined a future where he could protect himself, where he could be more than a silent observer. He felt the power of his mind, his perception, and most importantly, the bond he shared with Seraphine. But the palace did not sleep, and neither did its secrets. That night, as Kaelin lay in his chamber, he felt eyes on him. Not human eyes, not fully. Something ancient, unseen, moved through the halls, listening, waiting. He shivered and pressed a hand to his chest. Seraphine had taught him to recognize the feeling, the presence of a shadow too old and strong to confront alone. The next day, Seraphine guided Kaelin to a hidden wing of the palace, one that had been sealed for generations. Dust hung thick in the air, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like fragile lace. Kaelin ran his fingers along the cold stone walls, sensing the history hidden within them. "These walls remember," Seraphine signed. "They remember the kings and queens who walked here, and the mistakes they made. There may be answers here, answers about the shadows you see." Kaelin's pulse quickened. He had always felt the weight of his bloodline pressing down on him, but he had never understood why. Now, with Seraphine's guidance, he began to see threads of a story that stretched back generations. They found a room filled with ancient murals, depicting kings and warriors, princes and queens. One figure caught Kaelin's attention, a young prince strikingly similar to him, standing silently as a crown loomed above his head. Shadows seemed to crawl around the figure's feet, entwining him in chains that glimmered with a dark, otherworldly light. Kaelin signed quickly, "It is me. This is me." Seraphine stepped closer, reading the mural with him. "This is a warning," she signed. "Something in your bloodline, a curse perhaps. It has been waiting for the heir to awaken, to claim his place and to confront it. Kalen felt a chill run down his spine. He had always feared that his silence was a flaw, a weakness, but now he realized it might be a protection, a shield against something far darker than he had imagined. They spent hours in the hidden room, deciphering symbols and sketches, comparing them with texts in the library. Kalen's hands moved swiftly, translating his thoughts into signs and drawings while Seraphine guided him with gentle, precise gestures. Each discovery brought them closer, not just to understanding the curse but to each other. By nightfall, the palace was silent save for the occasional howl of the wind around the towers. Kalen and Seraphine sat together on the floor of the hidden room, exhausted but exhilarated. The bond between them had deepened, silent words and shared knowledge weaving an invisible thread of trust. Kalen sighed softly, almost to himself. If I fail, they will blame me. They will blame my silence. Seraphine's eyes softened. She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers warm against his skin. Then you will not fail alone. I am with you. A moment of quiet passed between them, a fragile peace in a palace full of shadows. But even as they rested, the air seemed to thicken, heavy with the presence of unseen eyes. Kalen knew, as he had always known, that danger never truly left the palace. The shadows were patient. They waited, and some shadows moved closer than he realized. As they prepared to leave the hidden room, a sudden chill swept through the corridor. Kalen's hand trembled in Seraphine's, and he signed urgently, "They watch us." Seraphine's brow furrowed. Who? Kalen shook his head. He did not know yet, only that the silent halls of the Obsidian Palace held more secrets, more threats than he had ever imagined. And the bond between him and Seraphine, strong as it was, might be tested sooner than either of them expected. Walking back through the corridors, hand in hand they felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down, sensing the stirrings of something long buried. The palace had begun to notice Kalen, the boy who had been ignored. And not all who noticed were friendly. Kalen looked at Seraphine, his storm-gray eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He signed slowly, deliberately, "I do not want to be invisible anymore." Seraphine squeezed his hand, her lips curving into a reassuring smile. "Then you will not be." But somewhere in the depths of the Obsidian Palace a shadow moved and a whisper carried through the cold stone halls. The air is awakening, and so is the curse. The following morning the palace felt heavier than ever. Shadows lingered in corners and even the sunlight seemed reluctant to touch the black marble halls. Kalen moved silently as he always did, his mind alert to every whisper of the wind and creak of the stone. Seraphine walked beside him, her hand lightly brushing his, a silent reassurance in a world that had always ignored him. "You feel it too, don't you?" She signed as they entered the library. Kalen's fingers trembled slightly. Yes, he had been dreaming again. Shadows that moved without sound, voices that spoke in riddles, warnings that seemed real enough to touch, and always the feeling that the palace itself was alive, waiting, watching. Seraphine led him to a tall shelf in the far corner of the library, one that no one seemed to use. Dust covered the tomes and the air smelled of old magic. She pulled out a book bound in deep violet leather, its cover engraved with symbols that shimmered faintly in the dim light. "This book," she signed, "is very old, older than the Alpha King himself. It holds the history of your bloodline and the shadow that follows it." Kalen's eyes widened as he reached for the book. His hands brushed the leather and a shiver ran through him. Something about it felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for him all his life. As he opened the pages, intricate drawings leapt out, kings and queens, princes and heirs, each marked by a strange, dark aura. The text was written in an ancient script, but Kalen could understand it through the magic of Seraphine's teaching. The bloodline of the Alpha King is bound by silence and shadow. Each heir is chosen by fate, and each heir carries the weight of a curse, the voice stolen to protect the kingdom from betrayal. The heir may see the truth in silence, but must learn to command it or be consumed by it. Kalen's heart pounded. He had always known his silence was unusual, but he had never imagined it was part of something so ancient, so deliberate. The curse! It had been waiting for him, shaping his life long before he understood the world around him. Seraphine placed a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm. "The curse is not all darkness," she signed. "It is a challenge, and challenges can be overcome. Kalen shook his head, unsure. I am only a boy. How can I overcome something that has lasted for generations?
Seraphine smiled softly.
You are not only a boy, you are the heir, and you are not alone. The truth of her words settled over him, warming the cold fear in his chest. For the first time he felt a flicker of confidence. His silence was not a weakness, it was a part of his strength. And with Seraphine by his side, he might finally learn how to wield it. But the palace was not silent. Far above them in the shadowed halls, eyes watched. The Alpha King, stern and commanding, had noticed the changes in his son. Kalen's posture was straighter, his eyes sharper, his confidence growing in ways that alarmed the court. The king had summoned his advisors to watch closely, though none dared approach the boy directly. They are teaching him, one advisor whispered. The scholar. She is dangerous. She gives him courage. Dangerous or not, another replied. The prince is the heir. The crown cannot be ignored forever. Meanwhile, Kalen and Seraphine continued their secret lessons. They spent hours in the hidden wing of the palace, deciphering the history of the curse, exploring symbols, and practicing subtle forms of magic. Shadows bent and moved in response to Kalen's focused mind, whispering faintly, almost like voices in another world. You can feel them now. Seraphine signed one afternoon, her eyes wide with wonder. The shadows respond to your will. Kalen's fingers moved quickly, shaping gestures that seemed to pull the shadows toward him. He felt a thrill unlike anything before. For the first time he understood that his silence was more than a shield. It was a way to see and manipulate the world in ways others could not. But mastery came with danger. A shadow stirred too close, resisting his control. The air grew cold and Kalen's pulse raced. He glanced at Seraphine, fear and determination mingling in his storm-gray eyes. I can do this, he signed, though doubt lingered. Seraphine nodded. You can, and I will help you. That night, Kalen had a dream unlike any before. The palace was burning, its walls twisted and alive with shadows. Figures moved within the flames. Faces of nobles, of guards, of the king himself. But all were distorted, malicious, and impossible to reach. And in the center of the chaos a figure stood tall, silent, with eyes that mirrored Kalen's own. He awoke with a start, heart pounding. The vision was vivid, terrifying, and strangely familiar. He signed quickly to Seraphine, the shadows. They are coming closer. The warning is real. Seraphine's eyes darkened. Then we must be ready. The curse awakens in more than just visions, Kalen. It tests you. It tests your courage, your wisdom, and your heart. Kalen felt the weight of her words, heavy as the stone walls of the palace. Yet beneath the fear, a spark of determination burned. He would not be a passive observer any longer. The court had ignored him, feared him, dismissed him, but now he had the knowledge, the magic, and the bond with Seraphine. He could face the shadows and perhaps even control them. The next morning, Seraphine led him to a forgotten courtyard. Vines had overtaken the stone, and the air was thick with the scent of flowers long untrimmed. In the center stood a stone pedestal, carved with symbols that glowed faintly in the morning light. This place, Seraphine signed, is where your ancestor faced the curse for the first time. You must confront it as he did, not with words, but with understanding. Kalen approached the pedestal cautiously. As he placed his hands on the cold stone, the air seemed to shift. Shadows rose from the ground like smoke, swirling around him, whispering warnings in voices only he could feel. His heart raced, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, grounding himself in the presence of Seraphine at his side. The shadows spoke not in sound, but in vision. Kalen saw flashes of the past, a young prince falling under the weight of expectation, a queen who hid secrets, an heir who could not speak but understood everything. He felt the pain, the fear, the isolation, but also the courage that had survived through generations. He raised his hands, shaping the shadows with the precision Seraphine had taught him. They twisted and bent, responding to his focus. The air hummed and the courtyard seemed to pulse with life. Kalen felt a strange exhilaration. For the first time he understood the balance between power and control, silence and voice. Seraphine watched him closely, pride shining in her eyes. You are ready, she signed softly. But just as he felt the first true surge of mastery, a distant sound cut through the courtyard, the echo of armored footsteps, deliberate and heavy. Kalen's hands froze. The shadows around him shivered, sensing intrusion. Seraphine's gaze sharpened. The palace knows. They are coming. Kalen's chest tightened. He had faced shadows of the past, shadows of his bloodline, but now he sensed a living, present danger. Someone was aware of his growing power, his bond with Seraphine, and their intentions were unknown. He signed urgently, "We must hide. Now." They moved quickly, slipping through hidden passages Seraphine had discovered, the shadows of the courtyard folding around them like a cloak. The sound of pursuit grew closer, and Kalen felt a surge of fear, but also a thrill. The first true test of his courage was at hand, and he would not falter. As they reached the relative safety of the hidden wing, Kalen paused, looking back toward the courtyard. Shadows lingered, whispering secrets he could not yet understand. He signed to Seraphine, "This is only the beginning." "The curse, it is awake," Seraphine nodded, "and so is the air." For the first time, Kalen felt the full weight of his destiny. His silence, his bond with Seraphine, his growing control over shadows. All were pieces of a puzzle that would determine the future of the palace, the bloodline, and perhaps the kingdom itself. But the court and the crown had eyes everywhere, and the awakening of the curse would not go unnoticed. As the two of them stood together in the dim light, hands brushing, shadows curling around their feet, Kalen felt something he had never felt before, a mixture of fear, determination, and hope. He was no longer the invisible boy, overlooked and dismissed. He was the heir, and the silent storm within him was beginning to rise. Outside, the wind whispered through the palace towers, carrying a single chilling promise. The air is awakening, and the shadows are waiting. The hidden wing of the palace was cold and silent, but Kalen felt a pulse of power beneath the stone floors. The shadows that lingered around him earlier had not left. They moved with him, whispering faintly, warning him of the dangers ahead. Seraphine walked beside him, her hand lightly brushing his, a silent reminder that he was not alone. "The court knows we are awakening the curse," she signed, her eyes scanning the corridors. "We must be cautious. The Alpha King will not allow this to go unchecked." Kalen's hands trembled slightly. He had never defied the king openly. His life had always been one of silence, of observation, of careful steps taken to avoid notice. Yet now he could feel the pull of destiny, the growing awareness of the power he held. He could sense the kingdom itself responding to him, the shadows bending slightly toward his will. "Then we move," he signed, determination tightening his fingers. "We will not be caught." They slipped through passages few had ever seen, corridors hidden behind tapestries, staircases folded into walls, and doors sealed by time. The palace seemed to bend around them, as if the shadows themselves were guiding their escape. Every step carried risk, but Kalen felt a thrill he had never known, a mixture of fear and freedom, the first taste of control over his own destiny. By the time night fell, they had reached the palace's outer gardens. The moon hung low, silver and watchful, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. The garden was wild and overgrown, a forgotten place where vines climbed the marble walls and flowers bloomed in darkness. Here Kalen felt almost at peace. "Here we can practice your power," Seraphine signed. "The shadows obey you. But tonight you must learn to control them fully. One mistake could reveal us to the palace." Kalen nodded, placing his hands on the cold stone of the fountain in the center of the garden. The shadows stirred at his touch, curling like smoke around his fingers, responsive to his thoughts. He felt the weight of the curse pressing against him, a force older than the kingdom testing him, demanding mastery. He lifted his hand slowly, and the shadows rose, forming shapes around him, walls of darkness, protective and alive, waiting for his command. He could sense the power flowing through him, raw and intoxicating, but he did not falter. Seraphine's presence grounded him, giving him focus. "You are ready," she signed softly. "Now trust yourself." A chill wind swept through the garden, carrying with it the faint echo of approaching footsteps. Kalen's heart tightened. The palace guards were near, sent to investigate the disturbances he had caused. Shadows shivered in response, alerting him to the danger before it arrived. "We cannot fight them all," Seraphine signed urgently. "We must move quickly." Kalen nodded, weaving the shadows around them like a cloak. The darkness swallowed their forms, hiding them from sight as they moved silently through the overgrown paths. Every breath, every heartbeat was heightened. The palace had never felt so alive, so threatening and yet so full of possibility. As they approached a secluded gate that led beyond the palace walls, Kalen paused. He could sense the presence of the curse, an ancient force watching him, testing him, urging him to understand its nature. He placed his hands on the cold iron of the gate and let the shadows flow through him, feeling their power merge with his will. The gate creaked open silently, revealing a path that led into the dark forest beyond. Seraphine grasped his hand, and together they stepped into the unknown, leaving the palace behind. The trees towered above them, their branches interlacing like fingers, and the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the secrets of centuries. Kalen felt the magic of the forest responding to him. Shadows flickered at his feet, rising to meet his commands. He realized that the curse was not only a challenge but also a gift, a connection to forces that could protect him if he learned to control them. They pressed deeper into the forest, moving cautiously. Seraphine pointed out hidden dangers, roots that could trip an unwary traveler, hollows where creatures might lurk, and patches of mist that could disorient even the most careful wanderer. Kalen absorbed every detail, every subtle warning, his senses sharper than ever. Hours passed, and they reached a clearing where the moonlight fell in silver pools. The air was thick with magic, old and powerful. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, covered in runes that glowed faintly. This was a place of ancient rituals, where the first heirs had faced the curse. Kalen approached the altar cautiously. The shadows around him stirred, responding to his thoughts, bending and twisting as if alive. He could feel the presence of those who had come before him, their fear, their courage, their silent strength. Seraphine stood beside him, signing gently, "The curse tests you, Kalen. But it can also teach you. Listen to it. Understand it. Command it." Kalen closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, feeling the pulse of the curse in the air, the weight of generations pressing down on him. He allowed the shadows to flow through him, shaping them with precision. Walls of darkness rose, protective and strong, forming a barrier between them and the world outside. The air shimmered as the shadows coalesced, forming visions of the past, the first Alpha King, the princes who had struggled, the queens who had hidden secrets, and the heirs who had fallen. Kalen saw their struggles, their triumphs, and their failures. He understood that the curse was not meant to destroy him but to prepare him, to teach him to master both the shadows and his own will. Suddenly the forest seemed to shift. Shadows moved unnaturally, twisting toward them with intent. Kalen's eyes snapped open. The curse was alive, testing him, but not alone. Something else was in the forest, a presence that was not part of the magic he controlled. Seraphine's eyes widened. "They have found us," she signed. "The palace sends more than guards now." Kalen's pulse quickened. He could feel the danger closing in, but this time he did not hesitate. He raised his hands and the shadows surged, forming barriers and illusions to hide them. Shapes of warriors, tall and dark, flickered into being, guarding their movements and misleading any who might follow. The presence advanced, but Kalen did not falter. He guided the shadows, weaving them into patterns that confused and deterred. The forest itself seemed to bend to his will, protective yet cautious, alive with the power of the air and the magic of the scholar who walked beside him. After what felt like hours, the threat receded. Kalen's chest heaved, his fingers trembling with exertion. He had never pushed the shadows this far, and yet they had obeyed him. He had faced a real danger and survived, not with swords or voices, but with understanding, focus, and control. Seraphine placed her hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. "You are no longer just the silent prince," she signed. "You are the heir who commands the shadows." Kalen's storm-gray eyes met hers, a mixture of fear, relief, and exhilaration in their depths. "The curse, it is part of me," he signed slowly, "and I will not let it control me." The night was quiet again, but the forest seemed to hum with energy, aware of the awakening power within Kalen. The air had begun to rise, no longer invisible, no longer powerless. And though the palace would never stop watching, he had discovered that silence could be strength, and trust could be the key to mastery. As they made their way back toward the palace walls, the first hints of dawn began to glow in the east. Shadows stretched long and thin, whispering warnings and promises alike. Kalen and Seraphine walked together, hands brushing, hearts beating in rhythm with the power that stirred within him. Kalen knew that the silent rebellion had only just begun. The court would notice his change soon enough, and the palace would react. But now he was ready, and Seraphine, ever at his side, would be his guide and ally, witness to the rise of the heir who spoke through silence and commanded the shadows. As they reached the edge of the palace grounds, Kaelin paused and signed one final message. The shadows watch us. And so do they. But we are ready. Seraphine squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with determination. Then let them come. We will face them together. Above the palace towers, the wind carried a whisper through the stone halls. The heir has awakened. The silent rebellion begins. And in that moment, Kaelin understood fully. He was no longer the boy who had been ignored. He was the storm rising, the silent power that could not be unseen, and the heir who would change the palace forever. The palace was quiet at first, too quiet, as if the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. Kaelin moved through the corridors, shadows following his every step, bending and twisting at his command. He no longer feared the whispers in the halls or the unseen eyes of courtiers. He had learned to listen to the palace in silence, to understand its hidden movements, and to use the shadows as allies. Seraphine walked beside him, her presence steadying him, her fingers brushing his as they moved. She had become more than a guide. She was a friend, a confidant, and a silent strength that mirrored his own. Tonight, she signed, her eyes dark with purpose, we face the final test. The Alpha King will know you have changed. The court will react. You must stand not only for yourself but for the bloodline and for the future of the kingdom. Kaelin's storm-gray eyes met hers. He could feel the power of the curse inside him, ancient and pressing, but no longer terrifying. I'm ready, he signed. I will not falter. They entered the grand hall, the center of the palace, where the council gathered in whispered anticipation. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The Alpha King sat at the head of the table, his expression stern, his eyes sharp and measuring. Around him, nobles and advisors whispered, casting glances at the prince who had been silent all his life. Kaelin stepped forward. His posture was straight, confident. The shadows at his feet curled like living ribbons, subtle but undeniable. The court fell silent, sensing something had changed. The king's gaze softened just slightly, as if he recognized the power within his son. He spoke, his voice echoing in the hall. Kaelin, you have returned from your wandering. I hear whispers. That you have learned things that none of us understand. Kaelin did not speak. He did not need to. He lifted his hands slowly, and the shadows responded, rising like smoke, forming shapes that reflected the history of the kingdom. Kings and queens, battles fought, and heirs who had fallen. The court gasped, some in awe, some in fear. Seraphine signed quickly. The shadows obey him. They reveal what is hidden, protect what is his, and guide what is to come. Kaelin traced patterns in the air, directing the shadows to form visions of betrayal that had lingered in the palace for decades. He showed the advisors who had whispered against the bloodline, the alliances formed in secrecy, and the plots that could have destroyed the heir. Every gesture, every movement spoke volumes, and the court understood. Kaelin was no longer a boy to be overlooked. He was the heir, commanding forces older than any of them could comprehend. The Alpha King's expression shifted, a mixture of pride and fear. He rose from his seat, his presence commanding, yet his voice softened as he addressed Kaelin. You have awakened, and you see what others cannot. This is not weakness, it is power. Kaelin's eyes met his father's, and in that silent exchange a bond formed, a recognition of the past and a trust in the future. The curse that had bound him was no longer a chain but a tool, a force he could wield to protect the kingdom and himself. But the night was far from over. From the shadows of the hall a figure emerged, one Kaelin had not expected. A nobleman, long thought loyal, stepped forward, anger in his eyes and ambition in his stance. He had discovered Kaelin's growing power and sought to challenge it. You claim to control shadows? The man demanded, his voice harsh. You are a boy, mute and powerless. You dare to stand before the Alpha King as his equal? Kaelin did not speak. He let the shadows rise, shaping them into walls and forms that surrounded the man. Subtle yet undeniable, the nobleman's courage faltered as the darkness twisted around him, revealing his own fears, his own insecurities. He could not lie. The shadows saw through him, and the court gasped at the display. Seraphine's hand brushed Kaelin's, her eyes steady. Control, not anger. Show him the truth, not just the fear. Kalen inhaled deeply, focusing. He shaped the shadows to reflect not just power, but understanding. Visions of what could happen if the kingdom fell to betrayal, and what could be achieved if loyalty and courage prevailed. The nobleman's face paled, and he dropped to his knees, humbled by the silent wisdom of the prince. The court murmured, a mixture of awe and respect spreading like wildfire. The Alpha King nodded approval and pride in his gaze.
Kalen, you have learned well.
Not only the strength of shadows, but the strength within yourself. Kalen lowered his hands, letting the shadows dissipate, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had accomplished. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer ignored. He was the heir, the protector, and the master of his destiny. Turning to Seraphine, he signed softly, "We did it." She smiled, her eyes bright, and signed back, "No, Kalen. You did it. I only guided you." A quiet moment passed between them, filled with unspoken emotions and the gravity of the night. Kalen had faced the curse, mastered it, and emerged stronger. He had proven not only his power but his wisdom, his courage, and his ability to lead. But the palace, old and full of secrets, still held shadows. Kalen knew that vigilance was necessary, that the legacy of the curse would always be a part of him. Yet he no longer feared it. With Seraphine at his side, he could face anything. Together they were stronger than any threat, wiser than any whisper of betrayal, and unbroken by the weight of expectation. The Alpha King rose, placing a hand on Kalen's shoulder. "The bloodline continues through you, my son. Your silence has been a gift, not a flaw. You have shown courage, wisdom, and strength beyond your years." Kalen's eyes met his father's, and for the first time he felt the full measure of his heritage, not as a burden, but as a responsibility and a gift. The court, too, recognized the transformation, bowing in respect and admiration. Later, in the quiet of the hidden wing, Kalen and Seraphine walked hand in hand. The shadows curled around them, protective and alive, but now they were familiar, trusted, even comforting. Kalen signed softly, "The curse. It is no longer my enemy." Seraphine nodded, her smile gentle. "It is part of you, Kalen. And you are part of it. Together you are stronger than it, wiser than it, and free from its fear." Kalen paused, looking at her, and signed slowly, "You stayed with me. You believed in me when no one else did." Seraphine's fingers brushed his cheek, tender and reassuring. "And I always will. Your strength comes from within, but it shines brighter because we walk together." A breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers and the quiet whispers of the palace. Kalen felt a peace he had never known, a calm born of understanding, mastery, and trust. He had faced the shadows, faced the court, and faced himself. He was no longer a boy who had been ignored. He was the heir, the master of silence, and the bearer of a power that could protect his kingdom. As they walked through the corridors, Kalen noticed the subtle changes. The guards who once avoided his gaze now nodded in respect. The advisors who had whispered against him now bowed in acknowledgement, and the palace itself seemed to hum with approval, recognizing its new heir. Yet Kalen knew the journey was far from over. The curse was a part of him, and the palace always held secrets. But he no longer feared the unknown. With Seraphine by his side, he could face any challenge, confront any betrayal, and command the shadows with wisdom and courage. The night stretched on, and in the hidden gardens, Kalen stopped, turning to Seraphine. He signed with a certainty that surprised even himself. "We are ready." For anything. Seraphine's smile was radiant, full of warmth and pride. "Yes, Kalen. Together, nothing can stop us." And in the silence of the moonlit palace, the shadows curled around them, protective, alive, and obedient. The heir had awakened, the curse had been mastered, and the kingdom had a new guardian, silent, powerful, and unbreakable. The wind whispered through the towers one last time, a soft, approving sigh. The heir stands. The bloodline endures, the shadows obey, and love will guide the silent prince. Kalen and Seraphine walked together, hand in hand through the halls of the palace, their bond unspoken yet unshakable. The future awaited them, full of challenges, mysteries, and possibilities, but they faced it with courage, strength, and trust. For the first time in his life, Kalen felt completely seen, not for what he could not say, but for all that he was. The boy who had been ignored was gone. The heir who had risen, who commanded shadows and hearts alike, now walked into the future with Seraphine at his side, ready for whatever came next.